This is the third civil rights video focusing on the period from 1945 to 54 and in particular the impact of two presidents, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. Harry Truman became president when Franklin Roosevelt died in March 1945. Truman had been vice president and under the American Constitution he replaced Roosevelt. He was then elected president in his own right in 1948. And Truman's a good example of how some racists can or did become increasingly sympathetic towards blacks in the middle of the 20th century. Truman was racist. He was born and raised in Missouri, which is a border southern state, and it would have been quite unusual if he hadn't been racist. His hometown of Independence had a population of 6,000 people, and most of the black residents over the age of 40 had been born as slaves. Blacks lived in shacks in an area of Independence known as Nigger Neck. They were unwelcome in most stores, they weren't allowed in the town library, and had a separate school. Words such as nigger and coon were commonly used, and Truman used both frequently and in public. His own ancestors had been slave owners. He told his future wife, Bess, that one man was as good as another, quote, so long as he's honest and decent and not a nigger or a Chinaman. Early in his political career, Truman paid $10 membership fee to the Ku Klux Klan. Although once he got involved in national politics, he seemed to change. As a senator in the late 1930s, he constantly supported legislation to abolish the poll tax. The poll tax was used to stop blacks from voting. It was a tax that you only paid if you wanted to vote. And obviously that means that if you're low income, like most blacks, you can't pay the poll tax, therefore you can't vote. And Truman also campaigned as a senator to stop lynching. In speeches, he argued that blacks should have equality before the law, civil rights and better housing. Although privately, he still continued to use the word nigger and told racist jokes. He was aware, though, that race relations were increasingly important in politics. Roosevelt had chosen him as vice president in 1943 because Truman had never in public made racist remarks. As president, Truman was still racist, but tried hard to be fair. He said legal equality for blacks was the black man's basic right, and he was horrified, genuinely horrified, by attacks that were made on black servicemen returning from the war. In September 1946, Truman established a Civil Rights Committee to investigate increasing violence against blacks. In October 1947, the committee produced its report, which was called To Secure These Rights. And it said that the USA could not claim to lead the free world while blacks were not equal. And in the context of the Cold War, that statement, that sentence is crucially important. To secure these rights called for anti-lynching legislation, abolition of the poll tax, voting rights laws, an end to discrimination in interstate travel, and an end to discrimination in the armed forces. Now, Truman didn't achieve all of those, but he did consistently work towards them. In 1948, for example, he used his executive power to overrule Congress and end discrimination in the armed forces. Now, it would take 2 to 3 years for that to actually take place and happen, largely because generals blocked it, but Truman was instrumental in making that happen. 1948 was a presidential election year, and Truman's pro-black, pro-civil rights stance split the Democrat Party, of which he was a member. Southern Democrats became known as Dixiecrats, and they wanted the openly racist Strom Thurmond to be their presidential candidate. To give an example of the type of man Thurmond was, he said that it was, quote, un-American to force us to admit the Negro into our homes, our eating places, our swimming pools and our theatres. Truman won the election in 1948 by capturing the liberal white vote and the black vote. He was the first president ever to campaign in Harlem in New York, and he picked up 2/3 of the black vote nationally. He believed that civil rights changes were essential for America's national well-being in respect of law and order, economic advancement, and its proclaimed leadership of the free world against communism. And it's that Cold War background that really explains Truman's actions. In real terms, Truman's changes were quite small. He did make more public housing available for blacks, he appointed a black judge to the federal courts, and established a Committee on Government Contract Compliance, which tried to make sure that federal defence contracts were not given to companies that discriminated against minorities. But he was held back, partly by Congress, which was dominated by Republicans and Southern Democrats, or Dixiecrats, and partly because public opinion, which was very slow to change. The most important thing that Truman did, really, was to awaken America's conscience to civil rights issues through his speeches and through his very symbolic actions. The next president was Dwight Eisenhower, who served as president from 1953 to 1961. And he could be forced into action to help blacks, but he had to be forced, and for the most part he was far less inclined than Truman to propel the USA towards racial equality. Again, he was from the South. He was born in an all-white town called Denison in Texas. He'd spent most of his life in southern states and in the segregated army. He was a general. He shared typical white fears of miscegenation, mixing of races. He wasn't keen that black and white people would be able to, quote, mingle socially, or that a Negro could court my daughter. He feared that desegregating schools would cause, quote, great emotional strains. And he was also a Republican. He was very aware that civil rights had split the Democrat Party, and it was that split that had helped Roosevelt win the election in 1952. It's perhaps no surprise that through his 8 years as president, he only met with black leaders once. However, during his presidency, one of the greatest achievements for the civil rights movement was won, and certainly its biggest achievements at that point. And it starts in Kansas. Kansas was one of 17 states who legally segregated, but it's not strictly in the South. It's a mid-central state. Church minister there, black church minister called Oliver Brown, decided to challenge segregated schools in the Topeka area of Kansas. Brown couldn't send his daughter, Linda, to a whites-only school 5 blocks away because she was black. She had to travel to an all-black school, which was 20 blocks away, a long journey which involved crossing a dangerous railroad track. The NAACP decided to support Brown in his appeal to the Supreme Court, and this became known as the Brown-Topeka case of 1954. The leading NAACP lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, represented Brown. This was a key event in Marshall becoming a nationally recognised figure. Marshall was an eloquent speaker, he was a physically impressive, handsome man, and the press started to take notice of him. He represented Brown before the Supreme Court and argued that segregation was unconstitutional. One of the members of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren, agreed, and he ruled that separate education was psychologically harmful to black children, and therefore illegal. Now, the Brown-Topeka ruling is highly significant. It's a great triumph for the NAACP's long legal campaign against segregated education. It gives them hope. It establishes in law that segregation is unconstitutional. If it's unconstitutional in schools, it must be unconstitutional everywhere else. But there's a big step between the Supreme Court saying something is unconstitutional and things actually happening at ground level. The mistake, if it was a mistake or deliberately left out, I'm not sure, but the downside of the Supreme Court's ruling was they gave no date. They said desegregation had to be achieved, but they didn't say by when. So there was no pressure on the South to change. There was no impetus to force them to change. And acceptance of the Brown ruling varied greatly across the South. In states like Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, no schools desegregated. And it would take further action and further protest to force changes in those states. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this one useful.